Hitch 22, a Memoir by Christopher Hitchens. Yvonne. I, of course, do not believe that it is Allah who determines these things. Salman Rushdie, commenting on my book, God is Not Great, remarked rather mordantly that the chief problem with its title was a lack of economy. What it was, in other words, exactly one word too long. But whatever one's ontology may be, it will always seem tempting to believe that everything must have a first cause, or, if nothing quite as grand as that, at the very least a definite beginning. And on that point I have no vagueness or indecision. I do know a little of how I came to be in two minds, and this is how it begins with me. I am standing on a ferry boat that is crossing a lovely harbor. I have since learned many versions and variations of the word blue, but let's say that a brilliant, if slightly harsh sunshine illuminates a cerulean sky vault and an azure sea, and also limns in the way in which these two textures collide and reflect. The resulting tinge of green is a lambent contrast with the darker vegetation on the hillsides and makes an almost blinding combination when, allied with those discrepant yet melding blues, it hits the white buildings that reach down to the edge of the water. As a flash of drown-on beauty and seascape and landscape, it's as good an inaugural memory as one could wish. Since this little voyage is occurring in about 1952, and I have been born in 1949, I have no means of appreciating that this is the grand harbor at Valletta, the capital of the tiny island state of Malta, and one of the finest Baroque and Renaissance cities of Europe. A jewel set in the sea between Sicily and Libya, it has been for centuries a place of the two-edged sword between Christian and Muslim worlds. Its population is so overwhelmingly Roman Catholic that there are, within a walled city, a great plethora of ornate churches, the cathedral being decorated by the murals of Caravaggio himself, that seductive votary of the higher wickedness. The island withstood one of the longest Turkish sieges in the history of Christendom, but the Maltese tongue is a dialect version of the Arabic spoken in the Maghreb and is the only Semitic language to be written in a Latin script. If you happen to attend a Maltese Catholic church during Mass, you will see the priest raising the communion host and calling on Allah, because this, after all, is the local word for God. My first memory, in other words, is of a ragged and jagged, but nonetheless permeable and charming, frontier between two cultures and civilizations. I am at this stage far too secure and confident to register anything of the kind. If I speak a few phrases of Maltese, it is not with a view to becoming bilingual or multicultural, but in order to address my priest-ridden nannies and the kitchen maids with their huge broods of children. This was the place where I first learned to see a picture of Catholicism as one of plump shepherds and lean sheep. Malta is effectively a British colony. Its most heroic recent chapter, the withstanding of a hysterical aerial bombardment by Hitler and Mussolini, and it had remained a solid possession of the Royal Navy, in which my father proudly serves, ever since the Napoleonic Wars, much more to the immediate point. I am standing on the deck of this vessel, in company with my mother, who holds my hand when I desire it, and also lets me scamper off to explore if I insist. So all things being considered, not too shaky a start. I am well dressed and well fed, with a full head of hair and a slender waist, and operating in a context of startling architectural and natural beauty, full of brio and self-confidence, and on a boat in the company of a beautiful woman who loves me. I didn't call her by this name at the time, but Yvonne is the echo with which I most piercingly and yearningly recall her memory to me. After all, it was her name, and it was what her friends called her, and my shell-like ear detected quite early on a difference between this and the various comfortable Nancys and Jones and Ethels and Marjories who, sterling types all, tended to be the spouses and helpmeets of my father's brother officers. Yvonne, a bit of class there, a bit of style. A touch or dash of garlic and olive and rosemary to sweeten the good old plain English loaf from which the fact must be faced. I was also sliced. But more of this when I come to Commander Hitchens. I mustn't pretend to remember more than I really do, but I am very aware that it makes a great difference to have had, in early life, a passionate lady in one's own corner. For example, noticing that I had skipped the baby talk stage and gone straight to speaking in complete sentences, even if sometimes derivative ones such as, according to family legend, "Let's all go have a drink at the club." She sat me down one day and produced an elementary phonetic reading book, or what used to be known to the humble as a speller. This concerned the tedious adventures of a woodland elf or goblin called Lobagob, his name helpfully subdivided in this way. But by the time I was done with it, I was committed for life to having some sort of reading matter within reach at all times, and was always to be ahead of my class in reading age. By this period, however, our family had left Malta and been posted to the much more austere surroundings of Rosyth, another naval base on the east coast of Scotland. I think Malta may have been a sort of high point for Yvonne. All British people were cut above the rest in semi-colony, and there was that club for cocktails and even the chance of some local help. Not that she longed to wallow in idleness, but having endured a girlhood of scarcity, slump, and then war, she couldn't have minded a bit of color and Mediterranean dash, and may well have felt she earned it. On our way back from Malta, we stopped for a few hours at Nice. Her and my first taste of the Riviera. I remember how happy she looked. The grayness and drabness of married quarters in drizzle-flogged Fifeshire must have hit her quite hard. But she and my father had first been thrown together precisely because of a drizzle and austerity, and the grim, grinding war against the Nazis. He, a career Navy man, had been based at Scapa Flow, the huge cold-water sound in the Orkney Islands, which helped establish and maintain British control over the North Sea. She was a volunteer in the Women's Royal Naval Service, or, in the parlance of the day, a Wren. My most cherished photograph of her shows her in uniform. After a short wartime courtship, they had been married in early April 1945, not long before Adolf Hitler had shoved a gun into his own, apparently halitosis-reeking mouth. One young and eager girl from a broken Jewish home in Liverpool, wed to one man 12 years her senior, from a sternly united, if somewhat repressed, Baptist family in Portsmouth. Wartime was certainly full of improvised unions, in which probably both at first counted themselves fortunate. But I know for a fact that while my father had never stopped considering himself lucky, my mother soon ceased to do so. She also decided, for a reason that I believe I can guess, to engage in the not-so-small deception of not mentioning to anyone in the Hitchens family that she was of Jewish descent. She herself had wanted to pass as English after noticing some slight unpleasantness being visited on my grandmother, who in the 1930s toiled in the military business. And Yvonne could pass too, as a light brunette with hazelish eyes, always to my fancy and imagination, a French aspect. But more to the point, I now feel sure she did not want either me or my brother to be taxed with die Jungfrage, the Jewish question. What I do not know is quite what this concealment or reticence cost her. What I can tell you something about is what it meant for me. The paradox was this: in post-war Britain, as in Britain and at all other times, there was only one tried and tested form of social mobility. The firstborn son had to be educated at a private school with an eventual view to attending a decent university. But school fees were high, and the shawls of class and accent and social position somewhat difficult for first-timers to navigate. Neither of my parents had been to college. One of my earliest coherent memories is of sitting in my pajamas at the top of the stairs, eavesdropping on a domestic argument. It was an easy enough one to follow. Yvonne wanted me to go to fee-paying school. My father, the commander, as we sometimes ironically and affectionately called him, made the heavy but obvious objection that it was well beyond our means. Yvonne was having none of this. If there is going to be an upper class in this country, she stated with decision, then Christopher is going to be in it. I may not have the words exactly right. She could have said ruling class or establishment, terms that would then have been opaque to me. But the purport was very clear. and from my hidden seat in the gallery I silently applauded. Thus a further paradox discloses itself. My mother was much less British than my father, but wanted above all for me to be an English gentleman. You, dear reader, be the judge of how well that worked out. And though she wanted to keep me near, she needed to argue hotly for my sake that I be sent away. I registered this contradiction very acutely as, alternating between the beams and smiles of maternal encouragement and the hot tears of separation, she escorted me to my boarding school at the age of 8. I shall always be slightly sorry that I didn't make more of an effort to pretend that I was desolated too. I knew I would miss Yvonne, but I suppose then I'd had the essential experience of being loved without ever being spoiled. I was eager to get on with it, and at the school which I had already visited as a prospective boarder, there could be found a library with shelves that seemed inexhaustible. There was nothing like that at our house, and Yvonne had taught me to love books. The cruelest thing I ever did, at the end of my first term away from home, was to come home for Christmas and address her as Miss Hitchens. I shan't forget her shocked face. It was the enforced etiquette to address all females at the school, from masters' wives to staff, in this way. But I still suspect myself of having committed a mean little attention-getting subterfuge. This perhaps explains the gradual diminution of my store of memory of Yvonne. From the ages of 8 to 18, I was to be away from home for most of the year and the critical rites of passage. From the pains of sexual maturity to the acquisition of friends, enemies, and an education took place outside the bonds of family. Nonetheless, I always knew how she was and could generally guess what I didn't know, or what was to be inferred from between the lines of her weekly letters. My father was a very good man, and a worthy and honest and hard-working one, but he bored her, as did much of the remainder of her life. The one unforgivable sin, she used to say, is to be boring. What she wanted was the metropolis, with cocktail parties and theater trips, and smart friends and witty conversation, such as she had once had as a young thing in pre-war Liverpool, where she'd lived near Penny Lane and briefly known people like the madly gay Frank Hauser, later director of the Oxford Playhouse, and been introduced by a boyfriend to the work of the handsome Ulster poet Lewis MacNeice, contemporary of Auden and author of Autumn Journal and her favorite, The Earth Compels. What she got instead was provincial life in a succession of small English towns and villages, first as a Navy wife, and then as the wife of a man who, let go by the Navy after a lifetime of service, worked for the rest of his days in bit-part jobs as an accountant or bursar. It is a terrible thing to feel sorry for one's mother or indeed father, and it's an additionally awful thing to feel this and to know the importance of the adolescent to do anything, the impotence of the adolescent to do anything at all about it. Worse still, perhaps, is a selfish consolation that it isn't really one's job to rear one's parents. Anyway, I knew that Yvonne felt that life was passing her by, and I knew that the money that could have given her the occasional glamorous holiday or trip to town was instead being spent, at her own insistence, on school fees for me and my brother, Peter, who had arrived during our time in Malta. So I resolved at least to work extremely hard and be worthy of the sacrifice. She didn't just sit there while I was away. She tried instead to become a force in the world of fashion, perhaps answering the call of her milliner forebears, but at any rate determined not to succumb to the prevalent dowdiness of post-war Britain. She was forever involved in schemes for brightening the apparel of her friends and neighbors. One thing I do have, she used to say with a slightly defensive tone, as if she lacked some other qualities, is a bit of good taste. I personally thought she had the other qualities too. On those official holidays where parents would visit my boarding school and any boys almost expired in advance from the sheer dread of embarrassment, Yvonne never did, or wore anything that I could later be teased about. And this was in the days when women still wore hats. She was invariably the prettiest and brightest of the mothers, and I could always kiss her gladly right in front of everyone else, without any fear of mushiness, lipstick stains, or other disasters. In those moments, I would have dared anyone to tease me about her, and I was small for my age. However, the dress shop business didn't go well. If it wasn't for bad luck, in fact, Yvonne would have no luck at all. With various friends and partners, she tried to float a store called Pandora's Box. I remember, and another called Susanna Monday, named for an actress of ours on the paternal Hampshire side. These enterprises just didn't fly, and I couldn't think why, not except that the local housewives were just too drab and myopic and penny-pinching. I used to love the idea of dropping by as I went shopping, so that she could show me off to her friends and have a general shriek and gossip over some coffee. But I could always tell that business wasn't good. With what a jolt of recognition did I read, years later, V.S. Naipaul's uncanny diagnosis of the situation in The Enigma of Arrival. He was writing about Salisbury, which was close enough to Portsmouth. A shop might be just 2 or 3 minutes walk from the market square, but could be off the main shopping track. Many little businesses failed, quickly, visibly. Especially pathetic were the shops that, not understanding that people with important shopping to do usually did it in London, aimed at style. How dismal those boutiques and women's dress shops quickly became, the hysteria of their owners showing in their windows. I might want to quarrel with the choice of the word hysteria, but if you substituted quiet desperation, you might not be far off. Even years later, when the term struggle had become, for me, almost synonymous with the words liberation or working class, I never forgot that the petit bourgeois knew about struggling too. I am speaking of the time of my adolescence. As the fact of this development became inescapably evident in early fall of 1964, according to my best memory, and as it came time to go back to school again, my mother took me for a memorable drive along Portsmouth Harbor. I think I had an idea of what was coming when I scrambled into the seat alongside her. There had been a few fatuous and bungled attempts at facts-of-life chats from my repressed and awkward schoolmasters, and some hair-raising speculations from some of my more advanced schoolmates, I myself being what was euphemistically called a late developer. And I somehow knew that my father would very emphatically not want to undertake any gruff moment of manly heart-to-heart with his firstborn, as indeed my mother confirmed by way of explanation for what she was herself about to say. In the next few moments, guiding the Hillmans smoothly along the road, she managed with near magical deftness and lightness to convey the idea that, if you felt strongly enough about somebody and learned to take their desires too into account, the resulting mutuality and reciprocity would be much more than merely worthwhile. I don't know quite how she managed this, and I still marvel at the way she both recognized and transcended my innocence. But the outcome was deep peace and satisfaction that I can yet feel, and on some especially good subsequent occasions have been able to call clearly to mind. She never liked any of my girlfriends, ever, but her criticisms were sometimes quite pointed. Honestly, darling, she's madly sweet and everything, but she does look a bit like a pit pony. Yet she never made me think that she was one of those mothers who can't surrender their sons to another female. She was so little of a Jewish mother, indeed, that she didn't even allow me to know about her ancestry, something that I do very slightly hold against her. She wasn't overprotective. She let me roam and hitchhike about the place from quite a young age. She yearned only for me to improve my education. She had 2 books of finely bound poetry, apart from the MacNeice, Rupert Brooke, and Palgrave's Golden Treasure, which I will die to save even if my house burns down. She drove me all the way to Stanford for the Shakespeare anniversary in 1966. And on the wintry day later, that year, that I was accepted by Balliol College, Oxford, I absolutely knew that she felt at least some of the sacrifice and tedium and weariness of the years had been worthwhile. In fact, that night at a fairly rare slap-up dinner out is almost the only family celebration of unalloyed joy that perhaps because it was mainly, if not indeed exclusively, about me, I can ever recall. It pains me to say that last thing, but the truth is that I can remember many nice country walks and even one epic game of golf with my father, and many good times with my brother Peter as well, and more moments with Yvonne than I can possibly tell about here. But like many families, we didn't always succeed in managing as a unit. It was better if there were guests or other relatives, or at least a pet animal to which we could all address ourselves. I'll close this reflection with a memory that I cannot omit. We had been for a family holiday. I think it may have been the last one we all had together. On the Devonshire coast, at the John Betjeman-style resort of Butley Salterton. I hadn't thought it had been too tense by Hitchens standards, but on the last day my father announced that men of the family would be going home by train. Yvonne, it seemed, wanted a bit of time to herself and was going to take the car and get home by easy and leisurely stages. I found I approved of this idea. I could see her cruising agreeably along in the roadster, smoking the odd cigarette in the careless and carefree way that she had, stopping as and when it pleased her, falling into casual and witty conversation at some of the better hostelries along the roads. Why on earth not? She was way overdue for a bit of sophistication and refinement, and a few days of damn the expense indulgence. She was home the next day with her neck in a brace, having been painfully rear-ended by some idiot before she had even properly embarked on the treat that was rightfully hers. My father silently and efficiently took charge of all the boring insurance and repair details, while Yvonne looked, for the first time I had ever seen her, deflated and defeated. I have never before or since felt so utterly sorry for anybody, or so powerless to assist, or so uneasy about the future, or so unable to say why I was so uneasy. To this day I can't easily stand to hear the Danny Williams version of her favorite Moon River, because it captures the sort of pining note that is the more painful for being inchoate. While shifting scenery at the Oxford Playhouse not long afterward, for one of the first wage packets I ever earned, I saw a production of The Cherry Orchard from the Wings, a good point of vantage for a Chekhov play, incidentally, and felt a pang of vicarious identification with the women who would never quite make it to the bright lights of the big city, and who could even count on the survival of their provincial ideal either. Oh, Yvonne, if there was any justice, you should have had the opportunity to enjoy at least one of these, if not both. She soon afterward gave me a black tie dinner jacket as a present to take to Oxford, being sure that I'd need formal wear for all the union debates and other high-toned events at which I would doubtless be starring. I did actually don this garment a few times, but by the middle of 1968 Yvonne had become mainly used to reading about my getting arrested while wearing jeans and a donkey jacket and carrying some insurgent flag. I have to say that she didn't complain as much as she might have done, though I do rather hate it, darling, when my friends ring up and pretend that they are so sorry to see you on TV in that way. Her politics had always been liberal and humanitarian, and she had a great abhorrence for any sort of cruelty or bullying. She fondly thought that my commitments were mainly to the underdog. For my father's flinty and adamant Toryism, she had little sympathy. I do remember her once asking me why it was that so many professional revolutionaries were childless, a question which seemed beside the point at the time, but has recurred to me occasionally since. Unless the police actually come to the house with a warrant, which they did, once after I had been arrested again while still on bail for a previous offense, she barely uttered a moan. And I was impatient to outgrow my family and fly the nest. And in the vacations from Oxford, as well as after I graduated and moved impatiently and ambitiously into London, I didn't go home any more than I had to. Even after all these years, I find I can hardly bear to criticize Yvonne. But there was something about which I could and did tease her. She had a slight, actually definite weakness for New Age, a faddish and cultish attractions. When I was a boy, it was Gaylord Hauser's Look Younger, Live Longer regimen, a smirking charmer's catchpenny diet book that enthralled about half the lower middle-class women we knew. As time progressed, it was the bogus refulgences of Khalil Gibran and the sickly tautologies of the Prophet. As I say, she could take some raillery about this from me, at least when it was about unwanted poundage or unreadable verses. But, and this is very often the awful fate of the one who teases, I did not realize how much unhappiness was involved. I did not remotely appreciate how much damage had been done until it was far too late. Allow me to relate this to you as it unfolded itself to me. Going back to Oxford one day, and after I had moved to London and had begun working at the New Statesman, I was striding down the High Street and ran straight into Yvonne just outside the Queen's College. We embraced at once. As I unclasped her, I noticed a man standing shyly to one side and evidently carrying her shopping parcels. We were introduced. I proposed stepping into Queen's Lane Coffee House. I don't remember how it went. I was in Oxford to keep some pressing political and sexual engagements that seemed important at the time. The man seemed nice enough, if a bit wispy, and had an engaging grin. He was called Timothy Bryan, which I also remember thinking was a wispy name. I felt no premonition. But the next time I saw her, my mother was very anxious to know what I thought of him. I said, becoming dimly but eventually alert, that he seemed fine. Did I really think so? I suddenly understood that I was being asked to approve of something. And it all came out in a rush. Yvonne had met him on a little holiday she had managed to take in Athens. She seemed to understand her perfectly. He seemed to understand her perfectly. He was a poet and a dreamer. She had already decided to break it all to my father, the commander, and was going to live with Mr. Bryan. The main thing I remember thinking as the sun angled across our old second-floor family apartment was, please don't tell me that you waited until Peter and I were old enough. She added at that moment with perfect sincerity that she'd waited until my brother and I were old enough. It was also about that time, throwing all caution, as they say, to the winds, that she told me that she had had an abortion, both before my own birth and after it. The one after I could bring myself to think of it with equanimity, or at least some measure of equanimity, whereas the one before felt a bit too much like a close shave or a near miss in respect of moi. This was the laid-back early 70s, and I had neither the wish nor the ability to be judgmental. Yvonne was the only member of the family with whom I could discuss sex and love in any case. I was then informed that she and Timothy had another thing in common. He had once been an ordained minister of the Church of England, at the famous Church of St. Martin in the Fields off Trafalgar Square, as I later discovered, but had seen through organized religion. Both he and she were now devotees of the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the sinister windbag who had brought enlightenment to the Beatles in the Summer of Love. I had to boggle a bit at this capitulation to such a palpable fraud. Have you given the perfect master any money? Has he given you a secret mantra to intone? But when the answer to the second question turned out to be a sincere and shy yes, I forgave her in a burst of laughter in which she, with slight reserve, I thought, none the less joined. It was arranged that Yvonne and the ex-reverend would come to dine with me in London. Feeling more loyal to my mother than disloyal to my father, I took the happy couple to my favorite Bengali restaurant, the Gangs in Gerrard Street. It was the heart of my culinary leftist Soho, and I knew that the management would be warmly hospitable to any guests of mine. All went well enough, and I could also affect to be cutting a bit of figure in my novice years as a scribbler in the capital. A hint of Bloomsbury, Fitzrovia, and Soho was, I knew, just the sort of spice that Yvonne would appreciate. I dropped an author's name or two, ordered that second carafe with a lazy flick of the hand, paid the bill carelessly, and wondered how I would conceal it on my expense account the next day. The former priest, Mr. Bryan, was not a bad conversationalist, with a fondness for poetry and the quotation of same. Outside in the street, importuned by gypsy taxi drivers, I used the word fuck for the first time in my mother's presence, and felt her both bridling a bit and shrugging amusedly at the inevitability of it. At any rate, I could tell that she was happy to be in the metropolis, and happy, too, that I liked her new man well enough. And I still have a rather sharp pang whenever I come to that corner of Shaftesbury Avenue where I kissed her goodbye, because she had been absolutely everything to me in her way, and because I was never ever going to see her again. I think that I must have talked to her after that, though, because the curry supper had been in the early fall of '73, and she telephoned me in London, and this is certainly the last time that I was to hear her voice, at around the time of what some people call Yom Kippur War, the Yom Kippur War, at some Ramadan War, and some the Ramadan War, which is in October of that year. This call was for the purpose of advising me that she intended to move to Israel. I completely misinterpreted this as another quasi-spiritual impulse. Oh, Mummy, honestly, I did still sometimes call her Mummy. And my impatience earned me a short lecture about how the Jews were made, the desert bloomin' were exerting themselves in a heroic manner. We were perhaps both at fault. I ought to have been less mocking and dismissive, and she might have decided that now, if ever, was the moment to tell me what she'd been holding back about our ancestral ties. Anyway, I counseled her against removing herself to a war zone, let alone taking someone else's bleeding Holy Land, on top of her other troubles. And though I didn't know it, we bid farewell. I would give a very great deal to be able to start that conversation over again. For my father to call was almost unheard of. His taciturnity was renowned, and the telephone was considered an expense in those days. But call he did, and not that many days later he came to the point with his customary dispatch. "Do you happen to know where your mother is?" I said no with complete honesty, and then felt that slightly sickened feeling that comes when you realize that you are simply but politely not believed. Perhaps this emotion was the late residue of my own recent complicity with Yvonne and Timothy. But my father did sound distinctly skeptical of my truthful answer. "Well," he went on evenly enough, "I haven't seen or heard from her in days, and her passport isn't where it usually is." I forget quite how we left it, but I shall never forget how we resumed that conversation. What it is to be 24 and fairly new to London, and cutting your first little swath through town. I'd had a few Fleet Street and television jobs and gigs, and had just been hired by one of the best-known literary political weeklies in the English-speaking world. I was lying in bed one morning with a wonderful new girlfriend when the telephone rang to disclose, as I lifted the receiver, the voice of an old girlfriend. Bizarrely or so, it seemed to my pampered and disordered senses, she asked me the very same question that my father had recently asked. Did I know where my mother was? I have never quite known how to ask forgiveness, but now I wish I had been able to repress the irritable thought that I was getting just a bit too grown up for this line of inquiry. Melissa, in any case, was as brisk and tender as I would have wanted to be if our situations had been reversed. Had I listened to that morning's BBC News? No. Well, there was a short report about a woman with my surname having been found murdered in Athens. I felt everything in me somehow flying out